This is a series of lectures about Jesus as a historical figure. And this is the second lecture called Why Not Just Read the Gospels? Because the question is, we talked in the last lecture about how do we know about this person, Jesus of Nazareth, as a figure of history? And you might think to yourself, well, don't we have 4 biographies of Jesus right there in the Bible? Why not just read those if we want to think about Jesus as a historical person? And that's a good impulse. We ought to read the Gospels to learn about Jesus. And they are, in fact, our best sources for knowing about the life of Jesus. But I want to suggest in this lecture that is a little bit more complicated if we want to act as a historian, knowing about the kind of person that Jesus was. It's a little bit more complicated than just reading the Gospels. So to introduce you to that idea, let's take a look at the Christmas stories, the nativity stories in the Gospels. Now, there are only nativity stories in 2 of the Gospels, in Matthew and in Luke. So we'll take a look at Luke's story first. In Luke's story of the birth of Jesus, an angel named Gabriel appears to Mary and tells Mary that she's going to conceive a child. Even though she's a virgin, she's going to conceive a child from the Holy Spirit, and that she should name this child Jesus. So Mary and her fiancé, Joseph, live in Nazareth, and they have to travel to Bethlehem because there is an empire-wide census. The emperor, Augustus Caesar, declares a census, and for this census, Joseph has to travel back to the hometown of his ancestor, David. And he travels, he takes his fiancée, Mary, who's pregnant at this point, along with him, and they travel to Bethlehem. And while they are there for the census, it comes time for Mary to give birth to the child. So where they go to stay, there's no room for them to stay, so they end up in a barn, and the baby is born in the barn, and they place him in a feeding trough. And then shortly after that, a host of angels appear in the sky over where some shepherds are taking care of their flocks. And these angels start singing to the shepherds, and they announce to them the birth of this baby. The shepherds come and visit him. So that's basically the story that takes place in Luke. And you'll recognize a lot of that from Christmas pageants and all sorts of things. In Matthew, there's a different story. In this story, the angel appears not to Mary, but to Joseph in a dream. Joseph has already discovered at this point that Mary is pregnant, and so the angel appears to him and tells him what's happening, that she's not been cheating on him, that there's been a miraculous pregnancy, and that he should remain with her. So in Matthew's story, it doesn't exactly say, but it seems that Mary and Joseph just live in Bethlehem. There's no impetus for them to travel in that story, no traveling to Bethlehem from Nazareth. And the baby is born at home. There's no story about a stable or about a manger or any of that. There's also no shepherds in Matthew's story. Instead, some magi, some astrologers and magicians from the far east see a sign, a portent in the heavens, a star that tells them to come to Bethlehem, where Mary and Joseph live, because they're looking for someone who will be a king. And so they follow this star. On their way through, they stop and talk to King Herod, who is the king of Judea, of Palestine at the time. And they tell him what they're up to, and Herod doesn't really like this idea that some young king has been born. He is some claimant to his throne, perhaps. And so Herod orders the murder, the slaughter of all children, all male children under 2 years of age born throughout the region. And so Mary and Joseph hear of this new decree, and so they have to flee. They have to get out of Bethlehem, and they flee to Egypt to hide and to be safe from the massacre until it's safe. And then they return, but when they return, they don't return to Bethlehem where they once lived. They instead relocate to Nazareth once the threat has subsided. So I often have students write out everything that happens in the Gospel of Luke. They read that nativity story and they write down every event, and then to do the same thing on the other side of the sheet of paper, write down everything that happens in Matthew's nativity story. And then I ask them to circle the things that overlap in those stories. And students are often surprised to find that almost nothing overlaps in these stories. They are, in fact, entirely separate. They share almost none of the same events. The only things that are shared between them is that Mary becomes pregnant as a virgin by some miraculous means, and that she gives birth to Jesus. Otherwise, all of the details are different. The details in this story can be harmonized together with the right kind of exegetical gymnastics, right? And so that's what we do. We tend to think of these stories as one story because most of us have our whole lives seen Christmas pageants where these two stories are blended together into one seamless narrative. But you actually have to do quite a lot of work to make those stories work together. And really, if you take Matthew at face value, that Mary and Joseph seem to be from Bethlehem and Jesus is born at home, then it becomes really impossible to harmonize the stories. So not only are these two stories totally separate and difficult to harmonize, they also have some historical issues, right? So in Luke's gospel, Mary and Joseph travel to Bethlehem because there is an empire-wide census. Caesar Augustus has declared the census. Well, the fact of the matter is, there never was any such census. We would have record of it. Caesar never declared an empire-wide census. But let's suppose that he did. Think about how this would work. According to Luke's own genealogy, Joseph's ancestor is King David, 41 generations ahead of him. So imagine what this would mean. If there were a census in the United States and you had to, in order to be registered for this census, travel to the homeland of your ancestor 41 generations ago. How would that work? How would you even know who it is? This is a world before Ancestry.com. To find your ancestor from 41 generations ago, and then everyone in the whole empire travels to whatever that place is, it would be pandemonium. It would be total chaos. And what would even be the point? Isn't the point of a census to take assessment of who is in a particular place at this time? There was, in fact, a census sometime after Jesus was born, in about 10 years or so after Jesus was born, in the year 6 of the Common Era, or 6 of what used to be called AD. So we'll call it 6 CE for the Common Era. This census took place when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. And so there is probably some historical referent that is at play here, but it's not quite possible the way that Matthew and Luke tell the story together. Herod the Great, who is a prominent figure in Matthew's story, died in the year 4 BC. So probably around the year, we'll call it BCE, the year before the Common Era. Herod the Great died in that year, probably around the same time that Jesus was born. So the census took place 10 years later. Quirinius was never the governor of Syria during the time of Herod the Great. So if you take into account the historical context, these two stories cannot be really harmonized at all. And finally, there's no record of Herod the Great ordering the mass murder of male infants in Bethlehem or the surrounding areas. It's the sort of thing that Herod the Great might have done. He was a very nasty guy. He did, in fact, make a command for the slaughter of a number of Jewish noblemen upon his death, because he was such a terrible and mean person that he knew that no one would mourn his death, and he wanted there to be great weeping throughout his kingdom upon his death. So he ordered the murder of some nobles. Fortunately, this order was never carried out, but there is no such ordering of the slaughter of young children in Herod's reign that we're aware of. So there's some problems harmonizing these two stories. There's certainly some historical inaccuracies and historical issues with the two stories. There also seem to be some very clear biases that the authors have. So we know that both of these authors, Matthew and Luke, we'll talk later about who these authors are, they want to present Jesus as the Messiah. That's part of their overall project, presenting Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. And both of them are familiar with traditions that Jesus is from Nazareth. Almost all of our stories about Jesus have him living and working in Nazareth. And so they know that that's the case. Jesus is from Nazareth in some sense. And they both know about prophecy from the prophet Micah, that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, in the city of David. And so both of these authors are struggling with how do we make that work, right? So we know that Jesus is from Nazareth, but we want to also say that he's the Messiah, and we think the Messiah should be born in Bethlehem. And so both authors have to take that theological claim against the historical realities that they know and try to make that work together, and they choose different ways of doing it. So Luke does this by creating a census. He has Mary and Joseph living in Nazareth, where we know Jesus was from, and he creates this census in order to get them to Bethlehem for the birth. Matthew, on the other hand, takes this same data and he says, well, we know Jesus is mostly from Nazareth, but we think that he must have been born in Bethlehem. So he has Mary and Joseph first living in Bethlehem, and then he gives them a reason, this slaughter that Herod the Great carries out, gives them a reason to move to Egypt, and then come back and relocate in Nazareth after that slaughter is over. So they're both working to make this historical data that they know work together with their theological claims about Jesus as the Messiah, and the prophecy that they're working with that gives us information about the Messiah. And they also use these in particular ways. So we know that Matthew, throughout his gospel, uses Moses as the archetype for Jesus. So many things in Matthew's gospel present Jesus as a new Moses. Well, if you know very well about the story of Moses, well, first of all, you'll know that he goes down into Egypt, right? That he begins his life there, and that he leaves Egypt and comes back to free his people from slavery in Egypt. And so it's no coincidence, I think, that when Jesus and his family have to flee from Herod's massacre, where do they go? They go to Egypt. This is very clearly part of Matthew's strategy of presenting Jesus as a new Moses. And if you know Moses' story, you know that it begins with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, as it were, ordering the slaughter of all male children. And so Matthew creates this story about Herod, who's ruling over Palestine at the time, ordering the slaughter of male children to mimic the story of Moses. It's not so much a historical claim as it is a theological claim told in a historical register, right? It's a theological claim about Jesus as the new Moses, but it's told in the register of story. Likewise, Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, and particularly you can see this in the second volume of Luke's work, which we call the book of Acts. One of the things that he's eager to do, living under Roman rule, is to present Christians and the followers of Jesus as being very compliant with Roman rule. All throughout Acts, you see him presenting the church as always complying with Roman rule. So Luke knows that this small-scale census of Syria, when Quirinius was the governor of Syria in 6 CE, ended pretty badly. There was a revolt. The Jewish people revolted against this census because it was a way of the Roman government extorting more taxes from the people that they occupied. And no one liked this situation very well, and it led to pretty massive violence, and it led to Quirinius being ousted. And so Luke wants to present the family of Jesus as people who did not rebel against the census, but in fact just go and gladly go to be registered. They'll travel back to the hometown of their ancestor. And he makes this an empire-wide census because it gives him the ability to have Jesus move, or have the family of Jesus travel way up in the north in Nazareth all the way down south to Bethlehem. So the stories in the Gospels, I've just given you an example of one set of stories, these nativity stories, but this can be seen in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. The stories in the Gospels don't always line up with one another. In fact, sometimes they're outright contradictory. And the stories in the Gospels include material that's historically inaccurate. It's perhaps legendary, just sort of made up for the purposes of the author. And the authors present material in accordance with their own very unique biases. So let me pause there to say, some people might be hearing this and feeling a little bit uncomfortable, thinking, well, I thought, isn't the Bible the Word of God? Shouldn't it always be accurate and consistent and not be biased? Well, whatever you think about the Bible as divine revelation, it is certainly also a human book. It is in the way that God always reveals God's self through the material world, through the real messy stuff that we know. The Bible is itself a participant in the world of creation. It's real and messy and human. It's a book written by human authors with their own agendas and their own ways of telling stories and their own perspectives. And so when we put the Bible on a pedestal and try to imagine it as this perfect, pristine text, the problem is not with the Bible, it's with us. That we come to it, we approach it in a way that isn't true to what it is. And so in looking at Jesus as a historical figure, we want to look at this text in a way that's honest, in a way that's true about what's actually happening in the text. And the text that we have is messy and contradictory, and we'll see what God reveals to us in that mess and in that contradiction and in those biases. Okay, so I told you we would talk about who wrote the Gospels. According to tradition, our canonical Gospels, that is to say, the Gospels that are in the Bible, are written by two of Jesus' disciples, Matthew and John. One is written by, traditionally, Mark, who is the secretary of another disciple, Peter, and recorded Peter's sermons. And then finally, one is written by Luke, who is, according to the book of Acts, a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. So that's what the tradition is. The fact is, we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. All four of the Gospels are actually published anonymously. So if you open a Bible, at the top of the page, it will say, the Gospel according to Matthew. But that wasn't there in the original text. Someone added that much later. None of the earliest Christians who quote from the Gospels attach names to them. Many early Christians quote these texts with no reference to who they might be written by. The first time we really get a name associated with any of the Gospels is in 130 of the Common Era, so about 100 years after the life and death of Jesus. A person named Papias mentions two Gospels, Matthew and Mark, but the Gospel he calls Matthew is not the Gospel we call Matthew. We know because he quotes some of it, and it's not the same Gospel that we call Matthew. And he also doesn't tell us anything about the Gospel that he calls Mark, so we don't know if it's the same Gospel that we call Mark. The first time someone names all four of the Gospels that we have in our Bible and names them in the same way that we name them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is Irenaeus in 185 of the Common Era. So 150 years after Jesus' life and death. There seems to have been an edition of the four Gospels that was published probably in Rome sometime between 155 and 185 of the Common Era, and it was circulated around Rome, and it gave those Gospels their names. It seems, though, from the data that we have in the text themselves, that the Gospels were not, in fact, written by any of the disciples of Jesus. You can tell this if you read the Gospels. None of them, they all speak in the third person. So none of them say, and then we, moved on and went to Galilee or whatever. They talk about Jesus and his disciples in the third person. They did this. He did this. They never say we. Also, none of the canonical Gospels claims to be written by an eyewitness to the events. None of them even really claim to have interviewed eyewitnesses. There are some, arguments about maybe Luke or John claim to have interviewed eyewitnesses, but if you read the text carefully, we don't have time to go into that at the moment, none of them actually claim to have talked to anyone who knew Jesus or who was there to witness the events. We do know this, that all four of the Gospels were written, all four of our canonical Gospels, were written by highly educated, Greek-speaking Christians. I say highly educated because literacy rates in the ancient world, and particularly in first century Palestine, were exceedingly low, something around 3%. And so, it's hard to write a book now in the modern world, but for someone to have written a book at all requires a high level of education. Jesus' disciples were not Greek-speaking, but Aramaic-speaking Palestinian peasants. You can imagine with literacy rates around 3% that peasants and fishermen don't do a lot of reading and writing. And even the book of Acts tells us that Jesus' disciples, at least Peter and John, who were both behind some of the traditions about who wrote the Gospels, were illiterate. Okay, so I want to talk about the Gospels as a developing tradition. The Gospels as a developing tradition. So several years ago, some scholars noticed a weird thing about three of our Gospels, about Matthew, what we'll call Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they noticed that there was a huge overlap between these Gospels in the stories that they tell. So about 75% of the Gospel of Mark and roughly 40 to 50% of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, because they're a little bit longer, tell exactly the same stories. And when I say exactly the same stories, I don't mean they tell the same story but kind of from a different angle. I mean almost verbatim, word for word. About 75% of Mark is shared in about 50% of Matthew and Luke. So what's happening with that? How are these texts written verbatim the same stories? And then you get a little bit of about a quarter of Matthew and Luke are also shared material, verbatim, the same stuff, that doesn't appear in Mark. And then, of course, every gospel has its own sort of individual stories and sayings that don't appear in other gospels. So this problem, this issue of what happened here that created this extreme overlap of language is what scholars call the synoptic problem. And we refer to those three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as the synoptic Gospels. It means in Greek, the same eye. You can see these three with the same eyes, meaning you could line them up in columns and read them together, and they look very, very similar. The Gospel of John is very different from these synoptic Gospels. Our fourth Gospel shares almost none of the same stories, and when it does have a couple of stories that overlap with the synoptic Gospels, it tells them in very different ways. So how is it that the synoptic Gospels came to be this way? Well, the prevailing theory among scholars is what's called the four-source hypothesis. And here's what the four-source hypothesis says. It says that the Gospel of Mark was written first. And the reason for that is that it wouldn't make much sense if somebody had the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Luke and was looking at that as a source. It wouldn't make much sense for them to write the Gospel of Mark, because Mark is shorter, so he would have to have cut a lot of stuff out. And particularly what he cut out was things like the nativity story. We looked at the Christmas stories from Matthew and Luke, but there is no nativity story in Mark. They would have to have cut out all of the resurrection appearances of Jesus, the appearance of Jesus to his disciples after his resurrection. Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark, believes that Jesus appeared to his disciples after his resurrection. He says so, but he doesn't have any stories about it, because apparently the writer of the Gospel of Mark didn't know any stories about Jesus appearing to his disciples after their resurrection. He didn't have access to any of these stories. And so it would be very strange to think that the Gospel of Mark would look at the Gospel of Matthew, let's say, and say, well, let's cut out the origin story of Jesus. Let's cut out the resurrection appearances. Let's cut out a lot of his most famous teachings. The Sermon on the Mount, we'll cut that out. It just wouldn't make sense. It makes a lot of sense, however, to think that Matthew or Luke could have been holding a gospel like Mark and expanded on it. They say, well, this is great. Let's take this gospel and let's add in some teachings that we know of Jesus. Let's add in an origin story, a nativity story. Let's add in some of these resurrection appearances. That makes a lot of sense. So we assume that the Gospel of Mark is our earliest gospel, that it was written first. But then Matthew and Luke, again, share a lot of material together that's not in Mark. How did that come to be? And the material that Matthew and Luke share that isn't in Mark has a peculiar character. Everything that they share that they didn't get from Mark is not a story. They don't share any stories that they didn't get from Mark. Every bit of what they share are just teachings of Jesus, mostly short sayings of Jesus. And when Matthew and Luke use these stories, they use them in the same order. So it seems most scholars of the New Testament assume that there was another written source that was just the sayings of Jesus, a collection of the sayings of Jesus that Matthew and Luke both had access to. And they used this source, along with Mark, to create their Gospels. The problem is we no longer have this source. If it ever existed, it doesn't exist now. It's just an assumed source. And so scholars of the New Testament call this source Q, which is short for the German Quelle, meaning source. So there's two of your sources for Matthew and Luke. You have Mark, which is a source for Matthew and Luke. You have Q, this sort of assumed source. People have created the Gospel of Q. You can go buy it on Amazon right now. What scholars do to recreate Q is they take Matthew and Luke, and they find all of their shared material that's not in Mark, and they pull all that out, and they have recreated the Gospel of Q. But then, of course, Matthew and Luke both had sources of their own, information that they included in their Gospels. We call those Gospels very creatively, those sources, M for Matthew and L for Luke. So that's your four sources for Matthew and Luke: Mark, Q, M, and L. That idea, that way of understanding how the Gospels came together is called the four-source hypothesis. Okay, so that's all very technical stuff about how the Gospels work together, but it is interesting because once you have figured out how the Gospels align, you can see the way that Matthew and Luke develop on the Gospel of Mark, how they take the stories in the Gospel of Mark and tell them in a new and different register. So I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a story in Mark chapter 6 about Jesus walking on water. And so the disciples are in a boat and a big storm comes and they're very afraid and the winds are going crazy. And they look out into the storm and they see Jesus walking to them on the water. And as he walks, the winds cease. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves. This comes from an earlier story, just before this one. Jesus had shared bread with thousands of people. He'd taken a couple loaves of bread and broken it, and it just keeps sort of multiplying until thousands of people are fed from these couple of loaves of bread. So when they see Jesus walking on the water, Mark says they were astounded because they didn't understand about the loaves. It's kind of weird, right? And their hearts were hardened. And that's it. That's where Mark ends the story. Matthew takes the same story, because of course Matthew uses Mark as a source. So he takes the same story and he plugs it in almost verbatim into his gospel in Matthew chapter 14. Except he adds some stuff. Matthew adds a story about Peter walking out to meet Jesus on the water. And then as they're meeting Jesus, the winds cease, Matthew says, just like in Mark. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Right? So in Mark, the disciples are just confused and their hearts are hardened. And in Matthew, in the same story, the disciples worship Jesus and call him the Son of God. Right? And so you see, there's this developing tradition. The disciples come more and more to understand Jesus as God. I'll give you another example of this. this time at the baptism of Jesus. We'll talk a lot about this story later. Jesus goes out into the wilderness to be baptized by a person named John. In our earliest gospel, in Mark, Jesus goes out to be baptized, and he's just the next person in line. John doesn't really notice him, doesn't think anything about him. He just baptizes him and moves on to the next person. In Matthew's gospel, we have John saying, the gospel says, John would have prevented him saying, I need to be baptized by you, but you come to me? And Jesus answered him, let it be so for now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. So in Matthew's gospel, you get this idea that John recognizes Jesus as someone special. In fact, by the time we get to our latest gospel, the Gospel of John, John the Baptizer doesn't even baptize Jesus. He just sees him coming and says, behold, there is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. We'll talk about why that is, why that develops in that way later. But you can see the trajectory that Jesus becomes more and more important in this story. In the first story, he's just someone being baptized. But as the tradition develops, Jesus becomes more important, more divine. In the earliest gospel, in Mark, right after the baptism, Jesus has a vision, a mystical vision, which, again, we'll talk about at great length later, where the heavens are opened and a dove, he sees a dove descending upon him. And there's a voice that speaks only to Jesus. And it says, you are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. Right? So Jesus is just the next person in line. Nobody else is experiencing this. This is a vision that Jesus is having in his own mind and his own spirit. It's a voice that he is hearing within himself. When you get to Matthew's gospel, though, the same vision takes place, but the voice that comes from heaven is a public declaration. It's not spoken within Jesus in his own heart. It's spoken aloud. It says, this is my son, not you, but this is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. And so again, Jesus is not just the next initiate in line. It's John is trying to stop him from being baptized because John recognizes his importance, and then the whole crowd recognizes God's words about Jesus. There's another story in Mark chapter 8. Again, in Mark, in our earliest gospel, in our earliest gospel, Jesus asks his disciples, so what are people saying about me out there? And they say, well, some people think that you're a prophet. Maybe you have the spirit of one of the prophets who's been sort of raised from the dead. And then Jesus says, well, tell me, who do you think that I am? And in Mark, in our earliest gospel, Peter answers and says, you are the Messiah. Now, you might think that that's a divine declaration, that Peter's saying Jesus is God in some sense. But that's not at all what Peter means by this. In Jesus' first century Jewish context, the Messiah is not understood in any way to be a divine figure. The Messiah is a political and military figure. He's a person who will oust the occupying Roman government, or whatever occupying force happens to be oppressing the Jewish people at that time. That he'll remove those people, that he'll reestablish the Davidic monarchy, reestablish native rule of Palestine, and that he will rebuild or cleanse the temple. Those are the roles of the Messiah, but he's not a divine figure in any way. That's a later Christian invention. So Peter's making a big claim about Jesus, but he's not making a divine claim. In Matthew, which is a later gospel, Matthew takes this same story, he lifts it from Mark and puts it in his gospel, chapter 16. But this time, when Jesus says, who do you say that I am? Peter answers, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Right? So again, you see this this increasing sense of Jesus' divinity as we move through the Gospels and history. In Mark's Gospel, in the earlier Gospel, when Peter says that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus tells him not to tell anyone about this. He sternly orders him not to tell anyone. But in Matthew's Gospel, when Peter says, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God, Jesus says to him, blessed are you, Simon, Peter, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Right? So this increasing sense of Jesus' divinity being known not only to the disciples, but to a broader audience. Okay, so what we see now is that there are some issues in the Gospels, some reasons that they're not problems with the Gospels themselves. The Gospels themselves are doing exactly what they set out to do. The problem is for us. When we want to, from our sort of modern Enlightenment perspective, think about these texts as sources for doing history, for understanding Jesus as a person of history. In other words, when we want to do with these sources something that the sources themselves never intended for us to do, then we run into some problems. And so we have to sort of rethink the way that we use the Gospels. So why not just read the Gospels to find out about Jesus as a person of history? Well, the reason that we can't do that is because that our best sources of information about Jesus as a person of history, these four Gospels, are not written by people who knew Jesus, and possibly not written by people who even knew anyone who knew Jesus. And the sources taken together sometimes contradict each other, sometimes in ways that can be harmonized and sometimes in ways that cannot be harmonized. When they do corroborate one another, when the stories are shared, often it's because they have collaborated, right? Often it's because Matthew and Luke have copied from the Gospel of Mark, have incorporated that into their gospel. So it's not really a corroboration at all. It's just a single source being repeated. And the authors show clear signs of bias. They're trying to present Jesus in a particular way, and as we move through history, we can see them develop the stories that they tell in accordance with this way of wanting to present Jesus. They present him as more and more divine, more and more important in his historical setting. And so together in our sources, we have certainly traditions that go back to Jesus himself, real things that Jesus did and said. But we also have development on those traditions, stories told in a way, stories maybe that happened, but told in a way that help the author's presentation of Jesus. And we have some legendary material, some stories that were just sort of made up for the moment. And those are all mixed together. The traditions going back to Jesus and the development on those traditions and truly legendary materials are all woven together. And so what are we to do if we want to take a look at this person as a historical figure that we want to follow? We want to follow the way of Jesus as he lived in history. How do we do that? That's what we're going to look at in the next session. What is it that a historian is to do with these very complicated sources?